The daycare worker handed me my completely limp baby and said he had a great day. Desmond's head lolled back like a broken doll. He had such a good nap, Miss Valerie said. Slept for 4 hours straight. When I tried to wake him in the car, he wouldn't respond. That's when I noticed dried pink residue around the nipple of his bottle. Panicking, I tasted it and immediately recognized the medicine taste, that fake cherry flavor from children's Benadryl. I went 30 miles over the speed limit the entire way to the emergency room, where the doctor confirmed Desmond had high levels of diphenhydramine in his system. "This is dangerous for an infant," he said. "How long has he been getting this?" I told him I hadn't given him anything and he must have gotten it at daycare. The doctor got quiet and then said something that chilled me. "Yours is the third baby from Sunshine Academy I've seen this month with the same thing." He said the other parents had been told their babies were just tired from growth spurts, but now he was seeing a pattern. I went straight back to the daycare and demanded to see the director. Mrs. Ansell took me into her office and closed the door. "That's a serious accusation," she said, when I showed her the hospital report. "Which teacher do you think did this?" There were only 2 teachers in the infant room, Miss Valerie, who'd been there 8 years, and Miss Rachel, who always seemed overwhelmed. "I don't know who did it, but someone drugged my baby," I said. She looked at the report and said she couldn't take action without proof of which employee was responsible. "We have cameras, but I can't show you the footage without a court order," she said. "That would violate my employees' privacy rights." I called the other parents from Desmond's room and found out 4 more babies had been unusually drowsy. One mom said her daughter had been so lethargic, she'd taken her to 3 different doctors thinking something was seriously wrong. Another dad said he'd complained directly to Miss Valerie about his son sleeping too much, and she'd told him he should be grateful for the rest. She actually said that parents today don't appreciate when they have an easy baby, he told me. But when I suggested we go to the police together, he got nervous and said he couldn't risk losing his daycare spot because his wife would have to quit her job. The next morning, I hid a camera in Desmond's diaper bag, one of those tiny ones that streams to your phone. I sat in my car in the parking lot watching the feed, and at 10:15, I saw it happen. Miss Valerie pulled a bottle of children's Benadryl from her purse and squirted it into 6 different bottles, including Desmond's. She did it so casually, like it was part of her normal routine, even humming while she swirled each bottle to mix it in. Then Miss Rachel walked in, and Valerie handed her 2 of the drugged bottles. Rachel gave them to the babies without questioning it. I had them on video committing a felony, but when I called the police from my car, the officer who answered said I needed to file a report in person. I drove to the station with the video ready on my phone, but the desk sergeant said daycare complaints went through Child Protective Services, not them. I called CPS from the lobby, and they said they'd investigate within 72 hours. 72 hours? I said. "They're drugging babies right now." The woman said without immediate danger of life-threatening harm, that was their standard response time. I went back to the daycare and pulled Desmond out of his crib myself. Miss Valerie stood in the doorway and said, "You can't just take him without signing him out." I showed her my phone with the video paused on her holding the Benadryl bottle. Her face went white, and she stepped aside. But as I was buckling Desmond into his car seat, Mrs. Ansell came out and said, if I removed him without proper sign-out, I'd be in violation of my contract and would forfeit my deposit, plus owe 3 months of tuition. "You're drugging babies and you want to talk about contracts?" I said. She smiled this cold smile and said, "Prove it in court. Until then, you owe us $6,000. She knew exactly what she was doing, because she'd done this before. That's when Miss Rachel came outside and whispered something to Mrs. Ansell that made her face change. They both went inside, and I heard shouting, but couldn't make out words. That night, Miss Rachel called me from a blocked number. "I didn't know what Valerie was doing until today," she said, crying. "I need to tell you something about Mrs. Ansell, but not on the phone. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop the next morning, but she never showed up. When I drove by the daycare, there was a sign saying, Miss Rachel no longer worked there, and Miss Valerie had been promoted to lead teacher. I posted the video in a local moms group on Facebook, and within an hour, it had 300 shares. But then it was deleted, and I was banned from the group. The admin messaged me that they couldn't allow unverified allegations that could harm a local business. That's when I noticed something strange in the video I hadn't seen before. In the background, barely visible, was a third person watching Miss Valerie drug the bottles, someone in scrubs who didn't work at the daycare. Listen to 90 seconds and rate me 5 stars on Spotify. Doing a giveaway for people who did this and show proof on my Instagram. There will be 4 winners, and you get to choose between a Spotify or Amazon gift card. I spent the entire night backing up that video to 3 different places because I knew this evidence was the only thing that mattered now. First, I transferred it to my laptop, then copied it to a flash drive I found in my desk drawer, and finally uploaded it to cloud storage, even though my internet was slow and it took 40 minutes. Every time I watched Valerie casually squirt Benadryl into those bottles while humming, my hands shook harder, but I forced myself to export the metadata and timestamps that proved exactly when and where this happened. The file properties showed 10:15 a.m. on the date, the GPS coordinates from my phone, and the device information that would verify I hadn't edited anything. At 6 a.m., I called the ER and requested written copies of Desmond's toxicology report, explaining I needed documentation for legal purposes. The nurse said it would take 3 business days to process through medical records, which felt like forever, but I filled out the release forms over the phone anyway, giving them my email and fax number and agreeing to pay the $25 processing fee. I scheduled an emergency follow-up with Desmond's pediatrician for later today, needing a doctor I trust to examine him and document any effects from repeated drugging I didn't know was happening. Dr. Smith's office squeezed me in at 10 a.m. after I explained the situation to the scheduler, who put me on hold for 5 minutes before coming back and saying the doctor wanted to see Desmond right away. Before the appointment, I texted Haley and 3 other parents from Desmond's room with a simple message asking if we could meet today to talk about our babies. 2 responded immediately saying yes, 1 said maybe depending on her work schedule, and Jude didn't reply at all, which worried me because I knew he was scared about losing his daycare spot. At the pediatrician's office, Dr. Smith examined Desmond thoroughly, checking his reflexes, listening to his heart and lungs, looking in his ears and throat, and measuring his head size and weight. She ordered baseline blood work to check liver and kidney function, since we didn't know how many times he'd been drugged, and she was visibly angry when I showed her the video on my phone. She watched it twice, her jaw getting tighter each time, and said this was the most disturbing case of institutional child endangerment she'd seen in 20 years of practice. The nurse took 3 vials of blood from Desmond's tiny arm while I held him, and he screamed, and Dr. Smith said the results would take 2 days, but she'd call me immediately if anything looked wrong. I met Haley and another mom named Sophie at a coffee shop that afternoon, and we compared notes about our baby's symptoms over the past few months. Sophie's daughter had been so sleepy that 3 different doctors ran tests for serious illnesses, including leukemia and brain tumors, and she'd spent over $4,000 on medical bills, trying to figure out what was wrong with her baby. Haley's son had been sleeping 12 hours straight at daycare, and she'd actually been relieved at first because it gave the teachers a break, but now she felt sick, thinking about what was really happening. We drafted a group complaint to submit to the State Child Care Licensing Board, attaching copies of my video evidence and medical records from all our children. Haley volunteered to coordinate signatures from other parents, and Sophie said she'd research which specific regulations Sunshine Academy had broken because she worked in compliance for a healthcare company and knew how to navigate regulatory systems. That evening, I received a formal email from Mrs. Ansell's attorney demanding $6,000 within 10 business days for breach of contract and threatening additional legal action for defamation. The email specifically mentioned my unauthorized removal of Desmond and false accusations against staff members, which told me they were preparing to fight hard instead of admitting what happened. I screenshot the threatening email and added it to my evidence folder, then drafted a careful response through a free legal clinic consultation where an attorney reviewed my situation for 30 minutes without charging me. The clinic attorney warned me that the daycare's contract probably had binding arbitration clauses that could complicate things, but she said child safety overrides contract terms in most cases, and I had strong grounds to argue I removed Desmond from immediate danger. She helped me write a response explaining I'd acted to protect my son from ongoing criminal activity, and she said to send it certified mail so we'd have proof they received it. Jude finally called me back late that night, whispering because his wife was asleep, and admitted he was terrified of losing their daycare spot because they couldn't afford for her to quit her job. I told him I understood the fear, but that more babies were being drugged every single day. We waited, and I could hear him crying quietly on the other end before he said he needed to think about it and talk to his wife. His voice broke when he said their son's name, and I knew he was imagining what I'd seen in that video, Valerie humming while she poisoned 6 babies, including his. I opened my laptop and pulled up the State Licensing Board's website, fingers moving fast across the keyboard as I filled out the complaint form with every detail I could think of. The portal asked for basic information first, then moved into sections where I could describe the incident and upload supporting documents. I attached the video file showing Miss Valerie drugging the bottles, then added PDF scans of Desmond's hospital records and the written statements Haley and Sophie had helped me collect from 4 other families. Each upload took forever because the files were large, and I kept checking to make sure they went through properly because losing this evidence to a technical glitch would destroy me. When I finally hit submit at 11:47 p.m., the system generated an automatic response saying my complaint had been received and would be reviewed within 15 business days. 15 business days meant 3 full weeks of Miss Valerie working with babies, while bureaucrats took their time reading paperwork. I stared at that number on my screen feeling sick, because 3 weeks was long enough for dozens more babies to be drugged, maybe long enough for something worse to happen, like what almost happened to Maya. The next morning, I called the licensing board's emergency hotline, which the website said was for situations requiring immediate intervention. A recorded message told me my call was important and asked me to stay on the line, then played hold music for 6 minutes before a woman answered saying her name was Patricia and asking how she could help. I explained as calmly as I could that I'd submitted a complaint last night about babies being drugged at a daycare and that the person doing it was still working there right now with access to infants. Patricia put me on hold without saying anything, and I sat there listening to more hold music for 7 minutes, wondering if she'd forgotten about me or decided my call wasn't actually an emergency. When she came back on the line, she said she'd pulled up my complaint and reviewed the attached video evidence while I was waiting. Her voice changed after that, got more serious and focused, and she told me they were escalating this to their investigation unit immediately and would schedule an inspection as soon as possible. I asked what that meant in actual days, and she said probably within 2 weeks, depending on investigator availability and scheduling conflicts with other facilities. 2 weeks sounded better than 3, but still felt wrong when babies were being drugged every single day. I pushed back, asking her directly what the definition of imminent danger was if this situation didn't qualify, because I had video proof of a crime happening and medical records showing babies were being harmed right now. Patricia sighed, and I could hear her typing in the background before she responded that she understood my frustration, but the board had to follow proper procedures for investigations. She said she would personally flag my complaint for the director's review and note that I'd called the emergency line expressing concern about ongoing harm, but she couldn't promise they'd move faster than the 2-week estimate without violating their protocols. I thanked her because she seemed like she was trying to help within whatever constraints she had, but after I hung up, I felt defeated, knowing that 2 more weeks of drugging would happen before anyone official even showed up to inspect. I spent the rest of that morning going through my video frame by frame, zooming in on different sections to see what details I'd missed before. The person in scrubs who'd been standing in the background was only visible for about 4 seconds, partially hidden behind a shelf unit in the infant room. I opened photo editing software on my laptop and started enhancing that section, adjusting brightness and contrast to get a clearer look at their face and clothing. The image stayed grainy no matter what I did, but I could make out enough to see they were wearing what looked like a badge lanyard in teal and white colors hanging around their neck. I zoomed in further on the badge itself, which was too blurry to read completely, but I could see partial lettering that might be initials or an abbreviation at the top. The scrubs were standard medical style in navy blue, and the person appeared to be watching Miss Valerie drug those bottles without saying anything or trying to stop her, which meant they either knew what was happening or were part of it. That afternoon, my boss called me into his office, closing the door behind us and gesturing for me to sit down. He asked if everything was okay, because I'd missed 4 hours of work this week between doctor appointments and phone calls, and several people had mentioned I seemed distracted during meetings. I explained briefly that my son had been in the hospital, and I was dealing with some serious childcare issues, keeping the details vague because I didn't want to get into the whole story at work. He nodded and said he was sorry to hear that, but then warned me that we were in a busy period with the quarterly reports due, and he needed me focused and present. I promised I'd do better and asked if I could use some vacation days to handle things, but he said the timing was bad and suggested I try to manage everything outside work hours if possible. Walking back to my desk, I felt another layer of stress pile on top of everything else, because losing my job right now would mean losing health insurance and any ability to pay legal bills. I spent my lunch break in my car calling family law attorneys, starting with 3 names I'd found through online reviews. The first attorney listened to my situation for 5 minutes before saying she didn't handle daycare contract disputes and suggesting I try someone who specialized in business litigation. The second attorney said he might be able to help, but would need a $5,000 retainer to get started, which I definitely didn't have in my bank account right now. The third attorney, a woman named Miss Smith who ran a solo practice, spent 20 minutes talking with me for free and gave me advice I could actually use. She said to document absolutely everything, keep copies of all communications with the daycare, and avoid any direct contact with them that wasn't through attorneys or official channels. She explained that defamation cases were hard to win when you had evidence like my video, but they could still be expensive to defend against, so I should be prepared for this to cost money I probably didn't have. Before we hung up, she offered to send one letter on my behalf for $200 if I needed it, which felt more manageable than $5,000. Haley texted me that evening saying 2 more moms from our group chat wanted to join us, both parents of babies who'd been unusually drowsy for months without explanation. One mom named Jennifer said her 10-month-old son had been hospitalized last month because he stopped gaining weight and seemed too tired to eat properly. Doctors had run tests for serious conditions like metabolic disorders and even leukemia, and she'd spent thousands on medical bills trying to figure out what was wrong with him. Now she was reading through our evidence and wondering if he'd been drugged the whole time, which would explain why he was too sedated to eat enough during the day. The thought of a baby being drugged so heavily that he couldn't even eat properly made me feel physically sick, and I had to put my phone down for a minute before I could respond to Haley's message. I created a shared folder that night using a cloud storage service, setting it up so all the parents in our group could upload files and see what everyone else had contributed. I added my video evidence, hospital records, the licensing board complaint, and all the communications I'd had with the daycare and their attorney. Within an hour, other parents started uploading their own medical records, showing similar patterns of lethargy and unexplained drowsiness, daycare communications, where they'd raised concerns and been dismissed, and billing statements proving they'd paid thousands in tuition while their babies were being harmed. Sophie, who worked in project management for a tech company, set up a timeline spreadsheet tracking every incident and symptom across all 7 babies now involved in our group. She color-coded different types of events and added columns for dates, times, which teacher was working, and what symptoms each baby showed, creating a visual pattern that made the systematic nature of the drugging impossible to miss. On day 6, I spent my morning researching investigative reporters at the local newspaper, looking for someone who'd covered institutional abuse stories before and might take our case seriously. I found Caroline Allen, who'd written a series last year about neglect and financial exploitation at a nursing home chain that led to state investigations and criminal charges. Her articles were detailed and well-researched, focusing on systematic failures rather than just individual bad actors, which seemed like the right approach for what was happening at Sunshine Academy. I drafted an email explaining the situation in broad terms, then created an anonymized clip from my video showing just the drugging action without any identifying information about the daycare or people involved. I sent everything through an encrypted email service, asking if she'd be interested in investigating institutional child endangerment at a local daycare chain, and emphasizing that I had extensive documentation including video evidence and medical records from multiple families. Caroline responded within 3 hours, which surprised me because I'd expected journalists to take days to reply to random emails. She said the allegations sounded serious and potentially newsworthy, but emphasized that she'd need multiple on-record sources and extensive corroborating evidence before her editor would approve moving forward with the story. She explained that daycare abuse allegations were legally sensitive because they could destroy businesses and reputations, so the newspaper's standards required documentation that would hold up in court to avoid defamation liability. She asked if I'd be willing to share the full unedited video, medical records with names attached, and contact information for other affected families who might agree to interviews. I read her email twice, understanding that going on record meant putting my name and face out there publicly, which could bring retaliation from the daycare, but might also be the only way to force real accountability and protect other babies from being drugged. Caroline responded at 7 p.m. saying she could do a video call right then if I was available. I set up my laptop at the kitchen table and opened the call, seeing her in what looked like a home office with bookshelves behind her. She asked me to share my screen and walk her through everything I had, so I pulled up the video file first and let it play from the beginning. She watched without saying anything as Miss Valerie pulled out the Benadryl bottle and squirted it into those 6 bottles, her face getting more serious as the video continued. When Rachel walked in and Valerie handed her the drugged bottles, Caroline leaned closer to her screen and asked me to replay that part. I played it 3 more times while she took notes on a yellow legal pad, writing fast and underlining certain words. She asked about the other families, so I shared my screen again to show her the spreadsheet Sophie had made with all 7 babies' symptoms, tracked across 3 months. Caroline scrolled through it slowly, asking questions about specific dates and which teacher was working on days when babies were especially drowsy. I opened the medical records folder and showed her Desmond's ER report, the toxicology results, and the hospital bills that proved this wasn't something I made up. She reviewed each document carefully, zooming in on the diphenhydramine levels and the doctor's notes about seeing 2 other babies from the same daycare with identical symptoms. After almost an hour of going through everything, she sat back and said, "This was absolutely publishable if I could get at least 2 parents willing to go on record with their names and faces. She explained that her editor required multiple confirmed sources for any story involving serious allegations against a business, especially one involving children, because the legal liability was huge if they got anything wrong. I told her I understood and would talk to the other parents, but I already knew that was going to be the hardest part because most of them were terrified. After we hung up, I sent a message to our group chat explaining what Caroline needed and asking who would be willing to use their real names in a newspaper article. Haley responded within 2 minutes saying she was in, that her daughter deserved justice, and she didn't care about the risks. Sophie said she needed to think about it because her company had strict policies about employees appearing in media coverage, and she couldn't risk her job. Jennifer said her husband would never agree because they were already dealing with medical bills from when their son was hospitalized. Jude didn't respond at all. Marcus, whose daughter Maya had just been hospitalized with respiratory problems, sent a private message saying he wanted to help, but needed to understand exactly what going on record meant and whether it would open him up to lawsuits. I spent the next hour researching whistleblower protections and typing up a summary of what I found, trying to give everyone enough information to make an informed choice without pressuring them. The problem was that even with legal protections, the risks were real. Going public meant potentially losing access to any daycare in the area if other facilities saw us as troublemakers. It meant having our names and faces attached to a controversial story that employers might Google during background checks. It meant possible defamation lawsuits from Bright Horizons, even if we won eventually, because defending yourself in court costs thousands of dollars most people don't have. I understood why people were scared because I was scared too, but I kept thinking about that person in scrubs watching Valerie drug those bottles and wondering how many other locations had the same thing happening. My phone rang at 9 p.m., and the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize with a local area code. I answered and heard a woman's voice identifying herself as Linda from Child Protective Services, calling about the complaint I'd filed regarding Desmond. She explained they needed to do a home visit to assess his current safety and my ability to provide appropriate care, and she wanted to schedule that for next week. I felt my frustration rising because I wasn't the one who endangered my child, but I kept my voice calm and asked when they were planning to actually investigate Sunshine Academy. Linda said that was a separate investigation being handled by a different unit, and she couldn't discuss details due to confidentiality rules, but the home visit was standard procedure for any report involving an infant. We scheduled it for day 13, which was still a week away, and she gave me a list of things to have ready, including Desmond's medical records, proof of his current childcare arrangements, and documentation of my income and housing stability. After I hung up, I sat at the table feeling angry that the system was investigating me, when I was the one trying to protect my son, but I started gathering the paperwork she'd requested anyway, because I couldn't afford to give them any reason to question my parenting. The next morning, I was carrying Desmond to my car when my neighbor, Mrs. Kim, came outside to water her plants. She's retired and probably in her late 60s, always friendly, but we'd never talked beyond basic hellos. She asked if everything was okay, because she'd noticed I'd been home during work hours lately and seemed stressed. I hesitated because I didn't want to share the whole story with someone I barely knew, but something about her kind face made me give her a general explanation about having to pull Desmond from daycare due to safety concerns and struggling to find temporary childcare. Mrs. Kim set down her watering can and said she'd raised 4 kids and would be happy to watch Desmond during my work hours if I needed help. I tried to thank her and explain I couldn't afford to pay much, but she waved her hand and said she didn't want payment, that she missed having little ones around. I insisted on giving her something because I couldn't take advantage of her kindness. So we finally agreed on $15 an hour, which was still way cheaper than daycare, but added up fast when I'd already paid Sunshine Academy through the end of the month. Starting that afternoon, I dropped Desmond off at Mrs. Kim's house each morning before work, and she sent me photos throughout the day of him playing with her old toy collection and napping peacefully in a portable crib she'd set up in her living room. Dr. Smith called on day 6 afternoon while I was in a meeting at work, and I stepped outside to take it because I'd been anxiously waiting for Desmond's blood work results. She said his liver and kidney functions were completely normal, which made me close my eyes in relief because I'd been terrified the drugging had caused permanent damage. She explained she wanted to retest in 3 months to monitor for any delayed effects, and was writing a detailed medical report documenting everything for legal purposes, including her professional opinion that the diphenhydramine levels in his system were consistent with intentional dosing rather than accidental exposure. I thanked her and went back inside feeling like I could breathe a little easier, at least about Desmond's immediate health. That night, I was scrolling through Facebook when a message notification popped up from an account with no profile picture and a name that was just random letters and numbers. I opened it and read one sentence that made my blood run cold. The message said, Sunshine Academy Corporate contracts an infant soothing consultant to visit locations with parent complaints about crying. There was nothing else, no explanation or context, just that single sentence. I stared at it trying to figure out who sent it and what it meant, but the phrase infant soothing consultant sounded like corporate speak for something much worse, like a sanitized way of saying someone who drugs babies systematically. I tried to reply asking who they were and how they knew this information, but the message wouldn't go through. The send button just spun and spun before showing an error message saying the account couldn't receive messages. I checked the profile, but it showed absolutely nothing, not even when it was created. Either they'd blocked me immediately after sending the message, or it was a fake account that had already been deleted. I took screenshots of everything anyway and uploaded them to our shared evidence folder, then sent a message to the group explaining what happened and asking if anyone else had received similar anonymous tips. Nobody had, which made me wonder if someone from inside Bright Horizons was trying to help but couldn't risk being identified, or if it was someone trying to mess with me by feeding me information I couldn't verify. On day 7 morning, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail requiring my signature. I opened it standing in my driveway and found a letter from Mrs. Ansell's attorney, this time 3 pages long instead of 1. The letter said I had 5 days to pay the $6,000 I supposedly owed, plus an additional $2,000 in administrative costs for the disruption I'd caused to their business operations. It specifically mentioned my campaign of harassment and coordination with other parents to damage the business, using those exact words like they'd been carefully chosen by a lawyer. That meant they knew about our group somehow, either because someone was monitoring our Facebook messages or because one of the parents in our group was feeding them information. I took photos of every page and forwarded them to the legal clinic attorney who'd helped me before, asking what I should do. She called back within an hour and said this was a classic intimidation tactic designed to silence me before the licensing investigation could proceed. She offered to send a response letter on the clinic's letterhead, explaining that I was exercising my legal rights to protect my child and report suspected abuse, which might slow them down even if it didn't stop them completely. She drafted it while we were on the phone and read it to me for approval, then said she'd send it that afternoon via certified mail, so we'd have proof they received it. I was sitting at my desk at work, trying to focus on an overdue project, when Haley called crying, so hard I could barely understand her. She'd received a similar demand letter that morning for $4,500, and her husband was furious that she'd gotten involved because they couldn't afford a legal battle on top of everything else. I could hear him yelling in the background about how she should have stayed out of it and let other people deal with their own problems. I talked to Haley for 20 minutes, explaining that these were scare tactics and that we were protected by whistleblower statutes as long as we were reporting genuine concerns about child safety. I told her about the legal clinic attorney and offered to connect them, so her husband could hear from a lawyer that we weren't doing anything wrong. She said she'd try, but I could hear the strain in her voice, that exhaustion that comes from fighting on multiple fronts at once, and I worried she might back out of going on record with Caroline if the pressure from her husband got too intense. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and started searching for information about teal and white lanyards used by medical staff. I tried different combinations of search terms like hospital lanyard colors and medical staff identification and clicked through dozens of images until I found a match on Valley Medical Center's website showing their contract nursing staff wearing the exact same teal and white pattern. I zoomed in on the photo and compared it side by side with the screenshot from my video, and the colors and design matched perfectly, down to the small logo placement. I made a note in my evidence folder that the person in scrubs watching Miss Valerie drug those bottles was likely connected to Valley Medical somehow, though I didn't know yet if they worked there directly or through a staffing agency. The next morning on day 8, I went to the State Licensing Board's website and filled out a public records request form asking for any complaints filed against Sunshine Academy or its parent company over the past 10 years. The form required my contact information and a detailed description of what records I wanted, and at the bottom, it said there was a $25 processing fee, and responses could take up to 30 days. I paid the fee with my credit card, even though money was getting tight, because I needed to know if there was a history of problems that the licensing board had ignored or covered up. Sophie called me around noon saying she'd been doing research on LinkedIn and discovered that Sunshine Academy wasn't independently owned, but was part of Bright Horizons Childcare Group, a big regional chain with 23 locations across 3 states. She'd found their corporate website and annual reports showing they spent over $200,000 a year on local media advertising, which suddenly made sense of why my Facebook post got deleted so fast from the moms group. I asked her to send me everything she found, and she emailed me links to their corporate structure, leadership team, and financial statements within minutes. That afternoon, Caroline sent me an email asking if I could verify the metadata on my video file to prove it hadn't been edited or manipulated, explaining that her editor wanted technical confirmation before they could move forward with publication. I replied immediately saying I'd send her the raw file directly from my phone along with the cloud backup timestamp, and I attached both files to my response so their IT department could analyze them. She wrote back 2 hours later confirming they received the files and would have results within a few days. I was sitting at my desk trying to focus on work when Sophie texted me a link to a Facebook post in a different parents group, one I wasn't part of, where a father was asking for advice because his 6-month-old daughter Maya had been hospitalized after an unusually long nap at daycare. The post said she'd stopped breathing normally and had to be rushed to the emergency room, and when I read that she attended Sunshine Academy, my stomach dropped. Sophie had already messaged him connecting him with me, and within minutes he called my cell phone. His name was Marcus, and he was crying, so hard I could barely understand him at first, saying the doctors told him another hour of respiratory depression could have caused brain damage or death to his baby girl. I asked him to meet me at a coffee shop near the hospital in an hour, and he agreed right away. When I got there, he was sitting at a corner table looking completely destroyed, his eyes red and his hands shaking as he held his phone. I sat down across from him and showed him my video of Miss Valerie drugging the bottles, and he watched it 3 times without saying anything before he started crying again. He kept repeating that he trusted these people with his daughter's life, that he'd dropped her off that morning thinking she was safe, and I told him I knew exactly how he felt, because that betrayal cuts deeper than anything else. We talked for almost an hour about our baby's symptoms, and the daycare's responses, and the way Mrs. Ansell had threatened us both, and by the end, Marcus said he wanted to do whatever it took to stop them from hurting more children. I explained about Caroline's investigation and how we needed parents willing to go on record with their names and faces, and he didn't hesitate for even a second before saying yes. I pulled out my phone right there and sent Caroline an email introducing Marcus as our second on-record source, and she replied within 20 minutes saying she'd schedule interviews with all 3 of us for day 17 to give her time to verify facts and build the complete story. Marcus and I exchanged numbers, and he thanked me for reaching out, saying he'd felt so alone until Sophie connected us. The next morning on day 9, I had a follow-up appointment at Valley Medical Center to get Desmond checked again. And while I was walking through the lobby toward the pediatric wing, I spotted a nurse wearing a teal and white lanyard identical to the one in my video. My heart started racing, and I walked over to the information desk trying to act casual, asking the volunteer there about the different colored lanyards I'd seen staff wearing. She explained that teal and white ones were for nurses contracted through MedStaff Solutions, a regional healthcare staffing agency that provided temporary and specialized nursing staff to hospitals and other facilities. I thanked her and made a mental note of the agency name, then went to Desmond's appointment, where the doctor said he looked healthy and showed no lasting effects from the drugging. As soon as I got back to my car, I called MedStaff Solutions and told the receptionist I was verifying employment for a reference check, making up a name and hoping they'd transfer me somewhere useful. After being put on hold twice, I got transferred to their contracts department, and I asked generally about their childcare consulting services to see what they'd say. The representative told me they provided specialized pediatric support to various facilities, including daycares, helping with infant care protocols and staff training, which confirmed my suspicion that the person in scrubs worked for them. I asked a few more vague questions about their services before thanking her and hanging up, not wanting to raise any red flags by being too specific. That evening, I went to MedStaff Solutions' website and searched through their services page until I found a section on infant care consultation listed as one of their offerings for childcare facilities. The description used phrases like evidence-based soothing techniques and sleep optimization, which sounded completely innocent on the surface, but took on horrible meaning given what I knew about Sunshine Academy systematically drugging babies. I screenshot the entire page and added it to my evidence folder, then sent the information to Sophie and Caroline so they'd have it for their research and investigation. The public records request arrived by email 3 days later with a PDF attached containing 14 pages of complaint history. I opened it at my kitchen table while Desmond napped and felt my stomach drop as I read through complaint after complaint filed against various Bright Horizons locations over the past 6 years. Most were marked as unfounded or parent misunderstanding in official language that made serious concerns sound trivial. 3 complaints specifically mentioned excessive infant sleeping or unusual drowsiness, but all 3 were closed without action after facility inspections that found no violations. I forwarded the entire file to our parent group chat, and within minutes Jennifer responded with an observation that made everything click into place. She'd noticed that several complaints were followed by refund offers attached to documents labeled settlement agreement, and when she cross-referenced the dates, parents who complained loudly and publicly got money and NDAS, while parents who complained quietly through official channels got dismissed. The pattern suggested Bright Horizons had a playbook for managing abuse allegations, paying off the vocal ones and stonewalling the quiet ones. Sophie jumped on Jennifer's theory and spent the next 2 hours tracking down contact information for parents who'd filed prior complaints. She found a woman named Angela on Facebook who'd complained 3 years ago about her son's excessive sleeping at a Bright Horizons location 2 towns over. Sophie messaged her explaining our situation and asking if she'd be willing to talk, and Angela responded within an hour, saying she'd call that evening. When Angela called Sophie on speakerphone with me listening, her voice shook as she confirmed she'd signed an NDA after her son was found with Benadryl in his system. She couldn't discuss specifics because of the agreement, but she warned us that Bright Horizons has very aggressive lawyers who will make your life hell if you fight them. She'd taken the settlement money because she couldn't afford a legal battle, and her attorney had advised her that proving systematic drugging would be nearly impossible without multiple families coming forward together. After the call ended, Sophie and I sat in silence for a moment before I told her we had something Angela didn't have back then. We had video evidence, and we had each other. The CPS worker showed up at my apartment exactly on time the next morning for the home visit I'd been dreading since day 6. She was a middle-aged woman with a clipboard and tired eyes who introduced herself as Linda and spent the next 2 hours reviewing every aspect of my life. She inspected the apartment, checking smoke detectors and outlet covers, reviewed my childcare arrangements with Mrs. Kim, asked detailed questions about my financial stability and employment status, and examined Desmond thoroughly while taking notes on his current health and development. I answered everything honestly and tried to stay patient even though the whole process felt backwards, like I was investigated instead of the people who drugged my baby. Linda's focus stayed almost entirely on whether I was providing adequate care now rather than on the abuse that happened at Sunshine Academy, which frustrated me more with each passing question. She asked about my support system and stress management and whether I had any history of mental health issues, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from asking why any of that mattered when there was video evidence of Miss Valerie drugging 6 babies. When I finally couldn't hold back anymore and asked directly about the investigation into Sunshine Academy, Linda's expression shifted into bureaucratic mode. She explained that their investigation of the daycare was completely separate from this home assessment, and she couldn't share any details about that process due to confidentiality rules that protected both the facility and other families involved. She said she'd submit her report within a week, and that I should continue current childcare arrangements, which at least confirmed Desmond could stay with Mrs. Kim. After she left, I sat on the couch feeling drained and angry that the system seemed more interested in checking boxes than in protecting children. That afternoon, I dug through the bag I'd brought home from the hospital on day 1 and found the bottle with dried pink residue still sealed in a plastic bag. I'd saved it thinking it might be useful, and now I knew exactly what to do with it. I called Dr. Smith's office and explained I wanted independent lab testing done on the bottle separate from the ER results, and she said she could arrange that through a toxicology lab she'd worked with before. The lab charged $400 for expedited testing, which was money I didn't have, but I put it on a credit card anyway, because I needed that scientific confirmation that would hold up in court. Dr. Smith's assistant gave me instructions for dropping off the bottle that evening and said results would take 5 to 7 business days. I drove to the lab after work and handed over the sealed bottle to a technician who logged it into their system and gave me a receipt with a case number. Driving home, I calculated how much this whole situation was costing me between lost work hours, legal consultations, lab fees, and Mrs. Kim's childcare payments, and the number made me sick, but I pushed the worry aside because Desmond's safety was worth any amount of debt. Caroline called the next morning while I was getting ready for work, and I nearly dropped my phone when she said her editor had approved the story. She explained it was pending final fact-checking and legal review, but publication was tentatively scheduled for day 18, which was only 4 days away. She needed me, Haley, and Marcus to come to the newspaper office on day 17 for on-record interviews and photo releases, and hearing her say it out loud made everything suddenly very real. I'd been fighting so hard to get someone to listen that I hadn't fully processed what it would mean when the story actually published. My face and name would be attached to accusations against a corporation with lawyers and PR teams, and everyone I knew would read about the worst experience of my life. Caroline seemed to sense my hesitation because she reminded me that sunlight is the best disinfectant and that going public was the only way to force real accountability. I agreed to the interview and texted Haley and Marcus to make sure they were still committed. Both responded yes within minutes, and Marcus added that Maya was doing better, but he'd never forget how close they came to losing her. My boss caught me in the hallway that afternoon and pulled me into his office with an expression that told me this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. He closed the door and said he needed to talk to me about my attendance because I'd missed significant work hours over the past 2 weeks and seemed distracted during meetings. I'd been expecting this conversation, but it still made my chest tight because I couldn't afford to lose my job on top of everything else. I explained the situation in general terms without going into details, and he listened with what seemed like genuine sympathy before warning me that we were in a busy period and he needed me focused. He said if I was going to keep missing work, I needed to submit a formal leave request because he was getting pressure from upper management about my performance. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with FMLA paperwork spread in front of me and filled out every line citing family medical emergency. The forms would protect my job legally, but they didn't solve the problem of lost income, and I tried not to think about how thin my savings account was getting. Jude called me the next morning, and I almost didn't answer because I'd given up on him joining our fight. His voice was shaky when he said he'd been thinking about his son and about Maya's hospitalization, and he couldn't stay silent anymore, even though he was terrified. He asked if it was too late to join our group and go on record with Caroline, and I felt something loosen in my chest as I told him it's never too late to protect children. We talked for 20 minutes about the interview process and what to expect, and I could hear him working up his courage with each question he asked. By the end of the call, he'd committed to meeting us at the newspaper office on day 17, and I texted Caroline immediately to let her know we had a fourth on-record source. She responded with 3 exclamation points and said this strengthened the story significantly because it showed the problem affected multiple families across different time periods. That afternoon, I was checking news websites during my lunch break when I saw a brief statement from Bright Horizons' corporate office that made my blood boil. They'd issued a carefully worded press release saying they were aware of allegations and conducting an internal review while maintaining that child safety is our highest priority. Every word was chosen to sound concerned without admitting anything, using phrases like taking these matters seriously and committed to transparency that meant absolutely nothing. The statement made me furious because they were managing PR and protecting their brand while babies were still being drugged at facilities they owned. I screenshot the statement and sent it to our group chat with a message saying, "This is exactly why we need to go public, because corporations only care about protecting themselves until the media forces them to care about protecting children." Sophie responded that the statement proved they knew something was wrong, but were trying to control the narrative before Caroline's story published. Jennifer pointed out that the phrase internal review was meaningless without external oversight and independent investigation. We were all learning to read corporate doublespeak, and it made me realize how many times institutions had probably lied to me before, and I'd just believed them because I didn't know any better. That same evening, a certified letter showed up at my door requiring a signature, and when I opened it, I saw Sunshine Academy's law firm letterhead across the top. The letter said I was interfering with business operations and that my continued harassment would result in a restraining order plus a lawsuit for something called tortious interference. They listed specific things I'd done, including recruitment of other parents and coordination with media, which meant they somehow knew about Caroline's investigation, even though we'd been careful. I read the letter 3 times, trying to understand all the legal words, and each time I got more angry because they were trying to scare me into silence while babies were still in danger. The next morning, I drove to the legal clinic with the letter, and the attorney read it slowly while making notes on a yellow pad. She looked up and said, "This was another scare attempt, but I needed to be really careful about any direct contact with Sunshine Academy staff or their building because they were building a harassment case against me." She explained they were trying to paint me as someone who was attacking a business instead of protecting children, and that I couldn't give them any ammunition by showing up at the daycare or contacting their employees directly. She spent an hour drafting a response letter on clinic letterhead that talked about my First Amendment rights and my duty to report child abuse, and she said this might slow them down, but the whole situation felt more risky now. I left her office feeling like I was walking on ice that could crack any second and wondering how protecting my son had turned into me being threatened with legal action. Dr. Smith called that afternoon and said the independent lab results were back and I could hear something in her voice that made me pull over to the side of the road to listen. She said they found 2 milliliters of medicine in the bottle left over, which was basically a full baby dose of Benadryl, and there was no way that happened by accident. She was writing an extra report explaining that this amount proved someone put it there on purpose, not by mistake, and this made our evidence way stronger, because now we had scientific proof. I thanked her about 5 times, and she said she was happy to help, because what happened to Desmond made her sick as a doctor and a mother. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started the hard work of finding out who the person in scrubs was from my video. I pulled up the MedStaff Solutions website and found their employee directory, but it only showed first initials and last names for privacy reasons. I opened LinkedIn and started searching for nurses with the right initials who worked in baby consulting, and after 2 hours, I had a list of 7 possibilities. I cross-checked each one against the staffing agency site and their public social media and slowly narrowed it down to 3 women who had the right credentials and worked in the right area. My eyes hurt from staring at the screen, and my back ached from sitting hunched over, but I kept going because I knew this person was important somehow. One of the 3 nurses had a Facebook profile that wasn't private, and when I clicked on it, I felt my stomach drop. Her name was Cecilia Robb, and she had checked in at different childcare places over the past 2 years, with comments like "another great day, helping little ones rest peacefully." The words made my skin crawl because rest peacefully sounded wrong when you knew babies were being drugged. And when I zoomed in on one of her photos, I could see clear as day she was wearing the teal and white MedStaff Solutions badge on a lanyard. I took screenshots of everything, including her profile, her work history, and all her check-ins at different locations, and then I started a new folder on my computer labeled Cecilia Robb Evidence. It was almost midnight, but I couldn't sleep, so I started writing an email to Caroline with everything I'd found about Cecilia, including her job history, her social media posts, her connection to MedStaff Solutions, and the enhanced screenshots from my video showing her in the background watching Miss Valerie drug the bottles. I hit send at 12:47 a.m., and Caroline responded at 7:15 the next morning, saying this was exactly the kind of organized evidence her editor wanted, because it proved this wasn't just one bad teacher but a whole system set up across multiple places. She said the story just got a lot bigger and a lot more important, and we needed to move fast before Bright Horizons figured out what we knew. On day 17, I woke up nervous because today was the day we were going on record at the newspaper office. I picked up Haley first and then Marcus, and we barely talked in the car because we were all thinking about what it meant to put our names and faces out there publicly. Caroline met us in the lobby and took us to a conference room with recording equipment set up, and she spent 90 minutes with each of us asking detailed questions about our baby's symptoms and the daycare's responses and how this whole thing affected our families. Marcus cried when he talked about Maya's breathing problems, and Haley's hands shook when she described the medical bills, and I felt exhausted by the end, but also like someone was finally taking this seriously and believing us. After the interviews, Caroline showed us the draft article on her laptop, and I read it twice, trying to take in everything. It included all our stories, plus the video evidence, plus medical records, plus information about Cecilia Robb's consulting work, plus the history of complaints at other locations, plus quotes from child safety experts saying this was one of the worst cases they'd seen. The headline said, "Regional Daycare Chain Linked to Organized Infant Drugging," and seeing those words in actual newspaper format made my hands shake, because this was really happening now. Caroline explained the article would go online at 6 a.m. on day 18 and be on the front page of the print paper that same morning, and she walked us through what to expect in terms of media attention and possible backlash from Bright Horizons. We signed photo releases and legal papers saying we understood we'd be publicly named and that we were telling the truth, and I felt both scared and determined as I drove home that afternoon. My phone buzzed with an email right as I was making dinner, and when I saw it was from the state licensing investigator, my heart started beating faster. She said they'd scheduled an inspection of Sunshine Academy for tomorrow afternoon and were requesting a warrant for all the security camera footage from the past 6 months. The timing was perfect, because Caroline's story would publish in the morning, which meant there would be public pressure on them to do a real investigation, instead of just going through the motions. I forwarded the email to our parent group, and everyone responded with excitement, mixed with nervousness, because we knew the next 24 hours would change everything. I barely slept that night, checking my phone every hour and running through responses in my head to all the things people might say when the story went live. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Miss Valerie's face in that video, so casual while she drugged those bottles, and I kept thinking about how many parents would read the article and finally understand why their babies had been so drowsy. At 5:45 a.m., My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline saying the story was live, and my hands shook as I opened the newspaper's website on my laptop. There we were on the homepage, our faces next to the headline, Regional Daycare Chain, linked to organized infant drugging, and the video was embedded right in the article playing on a loop. I read through the whole thing twice, my heart pounding harder with each paragraph, seeing our testimonies and the medical records, and Cecilia Robb's name in print with her connection to multiple facilities spelled out in black and white. By 8 a.m., the story had been shared over 2,000 times on social media, and my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages. Other parents I'd never met were texting about their own drowsy babies. Reporters from 3 different news stations were requesting interviews, and people I hadn't talked to in years were sending supportive messages saying they couldn't believe this had happened. I was sitting at my kitchen table trying to respond to everything when Haley called and said her phone was exploding too, and then Marcus texted that a TV crew had shown up at his house asking for a statement. At 9:15 a.m., the state licensing board issued a press release that Caroline forwarded to our group, and I read it 3 times to make sure I understood what it meant. They were imposing an emergency summary suspension of Sunshine Academy's license pending a full hearing, which meant the daycare was immediately shut down and couldn't operate at all until the investigation was complete. At 10 a.m., I drove to Sunshine Academy because I needed to see what was happening with my own eyes, and when I pulled into the parking lot across the street, there were already 2 police cars and an unmarked sedan parked outside. Officers were carrying boxes out of the building, and I could see through the windows that they were going through file cabinets and unplugging computers. Miss Valerie came out the front door with a female officer walking beside her, and even from my car I could see how pale her face was, nothing like the casual confidence she'd had when she was drugging those bottles on camera. They put her in the back of one of the police cars, but she wasn't handcuffed, and the officer explained to someone outside that she was being brought in for questioning about the medication found on the premises. I watched them load boxes labeled evidence into a van, knowing that somewhere in those boxes were the bottles and the Benadryl and maybe security footage that would show how many times this had happened before I caught her on video. By noon, Bright Horizons Corporate had issued their own statement, and Sophie sent it to our group chat with 3 angry face emojis. The statement said they were shocked and appalled by the unauthorized actions of a rogue employee who had violated every policy and protocol they had in place. They claimed they had never sanctioned or approved the use of any medication to manage infant behavior, and they were terminating Miss Valerie immediately and promising full cooperation with all investigations. But the statement didn't mention Cecilia Robb at all, and it didn't say anything about MedStaff Solutions or the Infant Soothing Consultant Program, which made it clear they were trying to blame everything on Valerie alone and protect the corporate structure. Caroline called me after the statement came out and said she was already working on a follow-up article about Bright Horizons' response and why certain details were conspicuously absent. Parents who'd been using Sunshine Academy started panicking about childcare within hours of the shutdown, and my phone kept getting added to group texts with people asking what everyone was doing for tomorrow and next week. Someone started an email chain to coordinate temporary solutions, and by mid-afternoon, we had 15 families trying to figure out how to cover work schedules with 0 notice. Haley sent a message suggesting we form a small co-op where we'd rotate watching each other's kids, and I replied immediately saying I was in because Mrs. Kim couldn't cover every single day. Within 2 hours, we had 8 families committed to making it work for at least the next few weeks, with a shared calendar and a rotation schedule that meant each parent would watch the group 1 day per week while the others worked. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, and it felt better than scrambling to find another corporate daycare that might have the same problems. On day 19 morning, I met with the state investigator at her office downtown, a bland government building with fluorescent lights and worn carpet in the hallways. She had me sit in a small conference room with a recording device on the table, and she explained that everything I said would be part of the official record and could be used in licensing hearings and potential criminal proceedings. For 3 hours, she asked detailed questions about the video, walking me through every frame and asking what I'd observed and when I'd noticed things. She wanted to know about every interaction I'd had with Miss Valerie and Mrs. Ansell and Miss Rachel, every conversation with other parents, every medical appointment for Desmond, and she took notes on a yellow legal pad while the recorder ran. When we finally finished, she turned off the device and told me my evidence was the most complete citizen documentation she'd seen in a child abuse case, and that the video combined with the medical records and my detailed timeline would be critical for the licensing board's decision. That afternoon, I drove to a law office on the other side of town for a consultation about the tuition demand and the defamation threats that kept showing up in certified letters. The attorney was younger than I expected, maybe in her early 30s, and she spent 45 minutes reviewing every piece of documentation I'd brought in a cardboard file box. She read through the hospital reports and the demand letters and my contract with Sunshine Academy, making notes and occasionally shaking her head. When she finished, she looked up and said, Bright Horizons had absolutely no legitimate claim against me for removing my child from immediate danger, and their threats were classic intimidation tactics meant to silence whistleblowers. She offered to send a letter on firm letterhead demanding they withdraw all threats and warning that continued intimidation could support a countersuit for abuse of process. And when I asked about her fee, she said she'd do it pro bono because the case made her furious and she wanted to help. The next morning, I took Desmond to Dr. Smith's office for a follow-up appointment, and she did a thorough examination checking his reflexes and responses and general development. She said she wanted to schedule monitoring appointments every 3 months for the next year to watch for any delayed effects from the drugging, explaining that most children recover fully from short-term antihistamine exposure. But we needed to track his sleep patterns and behavior and thinking development to be careful. I appreciated that she was being thorough even though it meant more appointments and more medical oversight, because I needed to know that Desmond would be okay in the long run and that the drugging hadn't caused any permanent problems I couldn't see yet. By day 20, 6 more families had contacted Caroline with similar stories about their children at other Bright Horizons locations. 2 were from facilities in different states, one in Ohio and one in Pennsylvania, and their descriptions of unusually drowsy babies and dismissive staff responses sounded exactly like what had happened at Sunshine Academy. Caroline was working on a follow-up investigation into the corporate structure, and Cecilia Robb's consulting work across multiple facilities, trying to determine if this was a systematic problem or just a few bad locations. She called me that evening to say she'd found invoices showing MedStaff Solutions had contracted with 7 different Bright Horizons daycares over the past 3 years, and that Cecilia Robb's name appeared on consulting reports for at least 4 of them. That same day, Bright Horizons started sending letters to families offering partial refunds with non-disclosure agreements attached, and 3 parents from our group forwarded me copies of what they'd received. The letters offered anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000, depending on how long the child had been enrolled. But in exchange, the parents had to sign agreements saying they wouldn't discuss the case publicly or participate in any legal proceedings against the company. Our core group had a conference call that night, and everyone agreed we wouldn't sign anything until the criminal investigations were complete, and real accountability was established, even though the money would help with legal bills and lost wages from all the time we'd been missing work to deal with this situation. I understand. I'll write the continuation as a single continuous paragraph covering beats 71 to 72, maintaining proper sentence structure with sentences under 30 words, using 6th grade vocabulary, keeping dialogue under 5%, and focusing on action-driven content. Here is the story continuation. The civil attorney called on day 20 afternoon with news about the tuition demand. She'd spent 2 hours on the phone with Bright Horizons' legal team and got them to agree to pause collection efforts until the licensing hearings and criminal investigations wrapped up. It wasn't a complete win because they didn't drop the claim entirely, but it meant I didn't have to worry about that $6,000 hanging over my head while dealing with everything else. She explained they were nervous about the bad press and didn't want to look like they were punishing a whistleblower parent while the story was getting so much attention. I thanked her about 5 times, because this removed the biggest financial stress I'd been carrying, and she said she was happy to help, because cases like this made her remember why she went to law school in the first place. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table preparing for the city council meeting scheduled for day 21, writing out what I wanted to say about childcare safety and the gaps in oversight that let this happen for so long. Haley texted asking if I was nervous about speaking publicly with TV cameras there, and I admitted I was terrified, but knew we had to do this. On day 21 evening, I drove to City Hall with Desmond in his car seat, meeting Haley, Marcus, and 4 other parents in the lobby before the meeting started. We all signed up for public comment and sat in the front rows waiting for our turn, and I kept rehearsing my speech in my head while watching the council members work through their regular agenda items. When they finally opened public comment, I walked up to the microphone with my notes shaking in my hands and 2 local TV cameras pointed right at me. I introduced myself and explained how I'd discovered my infant son had been drugged at a licensed daycare facility, how the system failed to respond quickly despite clear evidence, and how we needed stronger licensing requirements and more frequent inspections. I talked about the 72-hour CPS response time and the licensing board's 2-week inspection window, asking how many more babies had to be drugged while we waited for bureaucracy to move. My voice cracked twice, but I pushed through, explaining that systematic failures had endangered our children and urging them to pass a childcare safety ordinance with real teeth. When I finished, 3 council members thanked us for coming forward, and Councilman Rodriguez said he'd work with the city attorney to draft a childcare safety ordinance within 60 days. Walking out of City Hall into the parking lot, I felt the weight of 3 weeks of fighting settle on my shoulders, but also this cautious pride that we'd forced real attention to something that had been hidden for years. The co-op childcare we'd started was actually working better than I expected, with 8 families rotating schedules, so no one had to miss too much work. The kids were thriving with more personal attention than they ever got at Sunshine Academy, and watching them play together during co-op time reminded me why every exhausting moment had been worth it. Desmond was sleeping normally now, waking up alert and happy instead of drugged into that unnatural stillness, and seeing him laugh and reach for toys felt like proof we'd done the right thing. At home that night, I looked at the folder on my kitchen table labeled Hearing Preparation, filled with evidence and timelines for the upcoming licensing proceeding. I knew the legal process would take months, and outcomes were never certain, but I wasn't the panicked parent who'd rushed to the ER 3 weeks ago anymore. We'd built something stronger than individual fear, a community of parents who refused to be silenced and documented everything carefully, and forced institutions to acknowledge what they'd tried to hide. The story wasn't over because hearings were pending and civil claims were unresolved, and we still didn't know what criminal charges might follow. But tonight, Desmond breathed steadily in his crib without any chemicals in his system, and that was the victory that mattered most. Yeah, so that's basically how the whole investigation went down. Pretty intense 3 weeks, right? If you made it this far, might as well subscribe. I've got more parent advocacy stories coming your way. Take it easy, and I'll see you around.